will be able to hear it. So, but what Heather's going to be doing is giving us a summary of her work that she did for her master's thesis that she just completed, where she analyzed the bones from the Gilmore farm and then also from the field slave quarter and did a comparison. And what was really exciting about the work at Gilmore is this is the first time we had ever had a faunal analysis done at Gilmore. So we're super excited to have the information on what a post-emancipation African-American household would look like. But Heather did her field school here. It was in 2015, Heather?
Yeah, I think around then. Yeah, and I did 2 weeks of excavation. And I think I was the first person to ever do 2 weeks in a row.
Yeah.
Loved it so much.
Yeah, and then you had come back for a couple of times, and when Heather was looking for, she went into zooarchaeological analysis, which is the analysis of animal bones, and she'll get into this. It's quite an intense process to take the animal bones that we find at the site, which are fragmented, and actually identify them in terms of species, in terms of bone type. And so she worked with a bone collection in graduate school to do all this. So, but Heather's going to be giving us about a half-hour presentation of her thesis research and some of her findings, and then we'll open it up for questions. And you're still you've got the Heather. You have not turned in a copy of your thesis yet, have you? Or is it right at the end?
Just last night, I submitted it to the database. So
awesome.
I know, good. I'm waiting on final, just last minute formatting things. And then from there, it will be completely submitted. So I'm about done.
That's great. Well, we'll definitely, if it's close enough where you could send a PDF, I will send that out with this recorded.
Yeah, definitely. Yep, it's all in PDF format. All the content is completely done. It's just formatting. So yeah, I can send that out. I would be happy for you to distribute it to anyone who would like it.
Oh, that'd be great. I think everybody here would love to see it. We have some hardcore people on the line here, really dive deep into everything we're doing. So that'd be awesome, Heather. So well, without further ado, we will have Heather start. And Heather, the research that Heather has done is kind of our ultimate goal with people that are on the field school is kind of Heather's our dream field school student, where she continues on in graduate school and actually uses our data here at Montpelier for her thesis or dissertation. And in this case, what Heather was able to do was analyze a set of bone data that we had not had looked at yet. So super excited to see, hear what you found out about Gilmore, even though I heard it already because I was part of her, Mary and I were part of Heather's thesis defense. We were on her committee, but it'll be fun to hear this all again and be able to relax a little more and listen more intently. So, well, Heather, I'll let you go ahead and share screens and go ahead and get started.
Great. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. So just to give you a little bit about myself before formally going in and why I like this topic. I've always kind of liked animals a lot, and I've always kind of had a thing with animals, and I'm not very good with biology and doing like the internal organ type of stuff. And so I figured, what's one way to work with animals is if they're already dead. And all I have to deal with is their skeletons. And so this is how I kind of got into zooarchaeology. And then I had a really, really good advisor in grad school who influenced me to do a project like this where I could work with a large collection, and she had confidence in me, and that made me have a lot more confidence. And so I'm very thankful that everything worked out and it's almost done. I'm very thankful to have worked with Montpelier and to do this lunch and learn to share the knowledge that we found out. I'm really excited about it. It was a lot of fun, so I hope you enjoy. So my thesis was titled Pre- and Post-Emancipation African-American Foodways at James Madison's Montpelier. A zooarchaeological analysis of food preference and food access. And before we formally begin, I'm going to just give you an overview because I have a lot of information. It's a lot to talk about in 30 minutes. So I will start with an introduction about the topic and then also go into a brief introduction of the historical context, which I'm sure most of you already know about Montpelier, but I'll just rebrief. And then I'll talk about my research questions. I'll go into why is this project significant. I'll talk about what theory I used and the environmental context I used to frame my research. And then I'll talk about my methods, my results, my discussion, and then last I'll go into conclusions. Okay. First, it's important to recognize that the act of eating is a universal. It is an action that humans must do to satisfy their caloric and biological need for nutrition. And so this is one of the reasons I wanted to focus on Foodways. Everyone does it. You know, we eat daily. We eat 3 meals daily, most of us. But the way that the food is prepared and the way it's consumed is what varies. That's the thing that differs. And so I wanted to get into these differences of social, political, economic, and cultural factors that influence the creation, production, and consumption of food. That then contributes to how people construct their worldview and create a sense of self. This also relates to the idea that food traditions travel with cultures. Just picking up from one place to another, you don't leave behind the type of food that you made before, you take it with you. And so when Africans were forced into migration through the slave trade, they didn't just leave all of their flavors behind. They brought them with because that's what they knew how to make and that's what they enjoyed eating. Okay. So the project is located in Montpelier, of course, and I specifically looked at the field quarters and the Gilmore farm. And the period of focus for each, as you can see on the screen, is for the field quarters, it's 1809 to 1836. So this is the period of time before, during, and after Madison is president. And I wanted to do a wider range for this because you didn't only have the enslaved people working for Madison during his retirement period. You had them before and during as well, and they contributed a lot to the foodways of Madison himself, but also to their own community. And so it's important to recognize like the broader time period for the field quarters. And then in comparison, the Gilmore cabin is post-emancipation from 1860 to 1920, and that also spans several generations of Gilmore family, which is also important to note that there was more than one generation amongst those years. And subsistence differences were expected to differ between the contexts, not only because they were in different areas, but also because the time period was so different. So just temporally alone, there were going to be plenty of differences. It was about teasing out what those differences were and how it was reflected in the tangible bone evidence. And so here are my research questions. So my research questions were very robust, so I'm not going to read through each of them. But to simplify, my primary focus was on differences between the bone assemblages from the field quarters and the Gilmore farm, and I questioned whether these changes were due to time period, habitat, spatial organization, and if my research was capable of addressing how exchange occurred across the plantation. I also asked questions that were specific to zooarchaeological research and data collection, and this included proportions of domestic and wild species, body region distribution, diversity and equity of the animal population, cultural modifications such as cuts, butchery marks, or other types of procurement or cooking modifications. And then I looked into biomass and meat weight, but I do not discuss that in this presentation. However, it is a big chunk of my actual thesis document. And then lastly, I asked if there were any other factors that I might not have included that might affect the faunal assemblages and the quality of the bones themselves. So the significance of this research, I feel, is very, very clear, but it is capable of showing the agency and personhood of a group of people who historically and regularly get oppressed and discriminated against. And one of my favorite quotes from all of the books that I read during my research is the one on the screen from Michael Twitty that says, "The Atlantic world has been an incredible experiment in how an enslaved population could get away with enslaving the palates of the people who enslaved them." And I think that's such a powerful quote. I think it brings to light the influence that Africans and African Americans have had not only in the past, but also into today. And this occurred through a concept known as the Africanization of plantations. And this is where enslaved communities were able to continuously grow and reflect their traditions by stylistically choosing to modify European material culture. And this was highly capable because Europeans at this time were not making much effort to preserve European culture. It's shortly after the revolution. There's this disconnect between Britain and the newly formed colonies, and so there is no want for an association with Europe. And so this allowed for these cracks that Africans and African Americans were able to seep into and get their tradition into foodways. And these influences are recognized today as something we all know as Southern soul food. And so recognizing things like the origin of soul food is necessary because it gives that credit to the people who created it and who influenced and continue to have influence on these types of foodways today. And the theoretical context that I use directly relates to the significance. And this is what I used to frame my arguments. I used post-colonial and agency theory. And these theories focus on the consequences of colonial actions and intentions. And the point of it is to remove the focus from European colonies and place it onto the people who were oppressed by European actions. And so you can see how these people responded to Eurocentric patterns of life. And then agency theory is able to recognize that this oppressed group is the creator of their own culture, and it is capable of providing a voice. These two theories really bring the human first, and that was very, very important to me, especially as a person who does not identify with the African American culture. I wanted to make sure that the people of focus were at the forefront of this narrative. It's very important for that to be emphasized. I also use documented recipes like the one that I show on the screen here for Brunswick stew. These were capable of helping me with expectations of what types of animals I might find, what types of ways they might be prepared, and then also gave me an idea of what type of continuity and change might be present between pre and post-emancipation, because something like Brunswick stew was discussed thoroughly both pre and post-emancipation in other documents and resources that I was finding. So that tells me that there's that theme of continuing familiar flavors. And then I also looked at the environmental context through habitat and land cover. And this also helped to further expand what my expectations might be for types of animals. It helped me with the actual analysis of the bones. And based on the habitat that was present, in this case around 1946, I was able to hypothesize that the field quarters was likely to see species thriving in pasture and grassland, such as squirrel, rabbit, cow, sheep, goat, and chicken, whereas at the Gilmore farm, located primarily in forest and forest brushland, I was able to determine it would have been rabbit, squirrel, mouse, deer, raccoon, opossum, and wild birds. So more wild mammals at the Gilmore farm. And these were the methods that I used. I will talk about them more in depth as I'm going through the results, but I used standard zooarchaeological methodology and collected both primary and secondary information that was then converted into calculations. And important to note is that I only completed my calculations on animals that are considered consumable. Consumable animals are those that are culturally considered edible, and it may include the viscera, the skin, the meat, anything that culture in particular determines is edible. Whereas incidental species are those that just happen to, usually it's an animal that cohabitates with humans, such as like a snake or a mouse. They live in the area that humans are around, but they don't actually contribute to understanding foodways. And then there's also commensal species, which are those that have a higher status in human groups. So that would be like a cat or a horse, where they're more pets than, I don't think many people consume their cat after it dies, but that's how I've defined my consumable and non-consumable species. All right, so to get into the meat of it, I decided to organize my research using the minimum number of individuals rather than raw count. Raw count is also known as the number of individual specimens. And I chose MNI over NISP because MNI is an interpretive estimate that pairs elements. It also compares the size of specimens and also the developmental morphology, and all of those things are taken together to count for the fewest number of individuals in a specific taxon. Whereas the raw count, or NISP, it doesn't adjust for the overrepresentation of larger mammals that fragment more easily, or just animals that have more bones. So MNI just kind of helps to address that skew a little bit. So for the field quarters, the consumable species was 22 individuals, and that was represented by 8 different animal species, whereas the MNI of consumable for the Gilmore farm is 36 individuals, which was represented by 22 different species. In both contexts, mammal was the most common animal class found. I then divided my taxonomic abundances into domestic and wild species to recognize where the animals were being procured. Domestic species for the definition of my research were those that were raised by humans, while those that were wild are those that aren't domesticated. They just naturally live in habitats near humans. The field quarters assemblage was composed of 90% domestic species and 10% wild species, with the most common domestic animal as pig, and the only 2 wild species found were 1 white-tailed deer and 1 rabbit. Whereas the Gilmore cabin assemblage was composed of only 35% domestic species, but 65% wild species. So at the Gilmore cabin, the wild species that were identified were the ones on the screen, the deer and the rabbit, but also included those not on the screen: gray squirrel, groundhog, possum, muskrat, and other squirrel-like rodents. The Gilmore cabin also had fish and other birds too. Of the wild species, rabbit is the most prevalent for the Gilmore farm, and chicken was the most prevalent domestic species. I then evaluated body region, and understanding the most frequent body region in an assemblage is important because it can correlate to meat cuts, and meat cuts correlate to status. And so my goal really was to understand in the social, economic, political sphere where these individuals were in that quote unquote hierarchy. But I couldn't determine that, sadly. I didn't have enough bones. Like as you can see on the screen, there were very few number of bones that I could identify to a particular body region. But I did my best, and I made frequency distributions out of pig, cow, and then rabbit, just for Gilmore Farm, to show visually the frequency that these body regions were being eaten. And we do this through the use of the minimum number of elements. It helps to interpret body regions, but it also helps when you're coming up with your M&I, because you know that if you have a minimum number of elements of 5 scapula, but there's only 2 scapula in one individual, then you know that if you have 5 scapula, you have an M&I of 3. So even though I wasn't able to get much as far as meat cuts out of doing body region distribution, it was still able to help me determine my M&I, and that's very useful. And then here is the body region distribution for cow at the field quarters and the Gilmore Farm. Similarly, not very many identifiable body regions. And then I also did rabbit, and I did rabbit specifically for the Gilmore Farm just because of how many bones were present. There were 27 for rabbit. I could have also done chicken, because chicken had 26 identifiable bones. And so I wanted to show for rabbit, it gives a really good example of how this distribution works when you have a lot of bones. So you can see here the arm bone, the humerus there, is a high frequency of red, or 4. And that plus the other regions of the forequarters, so the scapula, the humerus, the ulna, that adding those together tells me that the forequarter was represented by 4 humeri, 1 ulna, 3 scapula, 3 ribs, and a few other bones. But that just tells me that the forequarter was the most popular, and then the axial was the next most popular. And it can get kind of confusing. So if you have more questions about it at the end, I can take a little more time to explain it. But I kind of tried to show it visually here. I then looked into cultural modification, and the one really good thing about cultural modification is it directly relates to a human action or behavior. And so this is one of the ways that as a zooarchaeologist, we can almost confirm that a bone is being at least used in foodways in some way. Like if there's a lot of cut marks on a bone, we can say, okay, they were eating this bone. But without those modifications, we can only assume that the assemblage is being eaten. So here you can see that a lot at the field quarters, a lot of the modification related to thermally altering the bones, whereas at the Gilmore cabin, thermal alteration was present, but so was cutting and puncturing. So there was a variety of modification at the Gilmore farm, whereas there was really only heat treating at the field quarters. I also looked into the diversity and equitability of the animal population itself. And I did this because I wanted to see how the distribution of the animal population in each location. And what this tells me when I calculate the diversity using the Shannon-Weaver Diversity Index, and that's measured on a scale of 1 to 5. So with diversity, the higher the number, the more diverse the population. And then the same with equitability, which measures evenness. The higher the number, the more evenly distributed the animal is. So what my results told me is that while the field quarters has a fairly low, it's actually pretty low, a very low diversity, there's not very many animals at that assemblage. But it has a fairly high, like moderate to high equitability, which tells me that the distribution of the animals or the frequency with which these animals are capable of being accessed is fairly easy. And that was reflected in my MNIs, where all of the animals had MNIs between 1 and 3, except pig, which had an MNI of 10. And then similarly at the Gilmore cabin, the animals were very easy to, all of the animals present, which the population was very, very diverse with a number of 2.95. So there were a lot of animals, but not only were there a lot of animals, they also were able to have access to all of those animals throughout whatever period of time. So that was really cool to look into how the animal population itself affects access to resources. And then to go into answering my research questions, I answered this first research question by first looking at the actual composition of the assemblages themselves. I analyzed in general around 13,000 bone elements. And for the field quarters, it was about 6,000 each context. And for the field quarters, I was able to identify 5,489 bones. Not all of them could be identified to the lowest taxon, but out of that, I got an MNI of 22, and that represents 8 species. Whereas for the Gilmore cabin, a lot of the bones, I was able to identify 367, so I was able to identify a lot less. However, the quality of the bones was just so much better that I was able to identify more. And so that resulted in an MNI of 54, representing 30 species total. And you can see this from the images on the right side of the screen. The top image is from the field quarters, and the bottom image is from the Gilmore farm. And these are the exact same fragment. They're imaged differently, but it's the same bone, and you can see the photo on the bottom. The Gilmore farm was just so much cleaner. It honestly doesn't really even look like it was in the ground. And so that really contributed to me being able to identify things at the Gilmore farm. I also then looked into, once I had these taxonomic abundancies and I knew what the assemblages told me, I looked into how the subsistence patterns changed pre and post-emancipation. I looked at other documentary resources as well to help me understand what a typical pre-emancipation diet consists of, and that is pork, beef, and chicken. And then similarly, the post-emancipation diet for resources, other documentary resources told me that it was rabbit, squirrel, pork, chicken, and pigeon. Both of these themes are corroborated by the results that I found. So the field quarters reflects this theme of pork, beef, and chicken pre-emancipation. And these dishes that might have been consumed included head cheese, or fried rabbit, or Brunswick stew. Like, those are some of the types of dishes that would have been consumed pre-emancipation. Whereas post-emancipation, the diet was much more variable, and there was a lot of access to different mammals, birds, and fish. And this included rabbit, squirrel, groundhog. All of those animals would have been roasted or fried, and then they could have been paired with game gravy or wild berry jams. And then some recipes also would have been the same, like boiled pig head or head cheese. However, it was kind of clear that there was this transition between restricted access to resources to more freeing access of resources. And so this helped expand the type of recipes that could have been created. I then looked into what kind of trade network might be present on Montpelier's property. And I wanted to look into this because I know that there's reports from other Montpelier archaeologists that say, you know, these ceramics from the South Yard are also being found all the way out in the field quarters. And I'm like, that's really cool. So obviously there's communication across the enslaved community. And so I wanted to see if that corroborated with food as well. Because if you think about how many recipes that we share with our friends and family, I just thought it seemed like a logical jump. However, I wasn't really able to get into it. It wasn't like the main focus of my research. And it kind of would look like a presence and absence type of comparison. But again, I didn't have enough data, and I think it's definitely an avenue for future research. When getting into the actual results, here are the big comparisons. Like I discussed, the difference between domestic and wild species, with the field quarters relying much more heavily on domestic and the Gilmore cabin relying on wild with supplementing with domestic. And that was like the biggest difference of everything. And then you have the body region differences, where the field quarters had mostly bones that were head, limb, or foot, whereas the Gilmore farm had the axial, the forequarter, hindquarter. Generally, those are better, like more favorable meat pieces. And so that also, it kind of discusses a little bit of status without going into actual meat cut type. But these animals that were being eaten were providing also foodstuffs. Like, they weren't just being eaten for meat. And this is something that's important to recognize too, is that domestic species don't just supply meat, and some wild species don't just supply meat. They also supply things such as eggs. And so I can only really see what I have tangible evidence for, but we also know that there's other sources of revenue because animals themselves produce other types of foodstuffs. And then to summarize the cultural modification, the most common type of modification for field quarters, like I said, was thermal. And looking at all of the bones for the Gilmore farm, the most common modification was cut marks. So that straight away tells you differences in the actions. And thermal alteration often is related to disposal, because when you are heating up a bone, the bone itself is not exposed to the flame, it's the meat. And so the high amount of thermal alteration at the field quarters tells me that a lot of disposal of bone material was happening. And this was confirmed with the fragmentary nature of the materials themselves. If there's not a lot of space, but you have a lot of people to feed and a lot of parties that you need to cook for Mr. Madison, then you're gonna need to break down the bones so you have that space in the future. And so that is what I believe happened. Disposal occurs in this shared yard space, which then contributes to fragmentary bones because you're trampling them or you're burning them to make them smaller. Whereas at the Gilmore farm, disposal happened either beneath the floorboards of the house, because the house was raised and had large cracks in the floorboards, or it was just deposited in the backyard. But there was no need for trampling because it's a small family living generation to generation. And so there I was able to see a lot more clear modification, like the cut marks, which then told me that these foods are actually being eaten because there is this tangible evidence. And then this question was kind of my catch-all question. I wanted to address anything else that I didn't address during my paper, and this is where my biases come into play, specifically with teeth. I identified for the field quarters alone 999 teeth, just shy of 1,000. And the teeth were in all kinds of condition, but teeth alone, finding 999 teeth does not tell me that I have 999 individuals, because one individual can have between 20 to 45 teeth. And so that was something I had to deal with, was how do I treat teeth in this situation? And for me, they became an indicator that the head and the mandible and maxilla were present in the assemblage, but it didn't tell me much more than that. It didn't contribute to really quantifying a number of species. But as you can see on the screen, I did find cow, I found pig teeth, I found goat and sheep teeth, so it was pretty cool. And then similarly with chicken, eggshell, fish spines and scales, and gullet stones, these are related to animals, but they are not bone material. And so as far as working with the faunal remains, it doesn't help quantify the results. It also can get really confusing because a chicken eggshell, in particular, it breaks into 100+ pieces. And it would just not be reasonable to take the time to put all those pieces back together to maybe make one eggshell, if that. You're not going to have all of those pieces. And so I ended up not including eggshell, fish spines, and scales, gallstones into my research because it wouldn't help in any way. It wouldn't add to the discussion. Okay. So as I started, I said, you know, eating is a universal. The act of modifying and creating flavors is also universal. And recognizing the personal or community food preferences is important because eating is this actively reoccurring event in a human's daily life. And understanding what an individual likes to eat helps us understand more about an individual themselves. Food preference is supported by the idea that people will modify the available foods to best meet their nutritional needs, while also creating dominant flavors that please their palates. And modification can be as simple as cracking off the outer shell of a nut, or it can be taking those flavors that you had from home and bringing them with you to create new food that's known today as soul food. Either way, whatever type of modification it is, it occurs naturally and needs to be done for a human to eat. And so this thesis specifically addresses gaps about understanding the continuity and change between African American foodway patterns pre and post-emancipation. And it discusses the importance of African food traditions to modern culture. In conclusion, differences and similarities exist between the faunal remains present at the Gilmore farm and the field quarters, and these differences are influenced by time period, proximity to the main house, and access to available resources. Understanding differences between food availability and preference of individuals pre- and post-emancipation contributes to understanding the transition from slavery to freedom. Recognizing the influence of African cultures on food provides an outlet for individuals to express themselves and their specific tastes associated with culture and tradition, and shows the impact of this culture on our world today. But most importantly, African individuals are the narrators of their own food histories and are capable of exhibiting personal agency and the power of preference. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Heather. That was absolutely wonderful. So yeah, we'll open up the floor if anybody has any questions. I know I've got a couple, but I'll hold on to mine for a minute or two.
Do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, if you could stop sharing, that'd be great. And then if you need to, if somebody has a specific question, you could share and then go back to slides if you need. So
great. Yep.
I have a question. I realize the field quarters and the Gilmore cabin represent two different time periods, but I was just wondering if there's any way of sorting the bones from any given site but according to when the bones were deposited in the ground.
That is another issue. I don't talk about it in my presentation here, but I do discuss it at some point in my thesis about how this was just, these bone assemblages are from this period. And I wish that we could go, you know, inch by inch and like know what exact year it's associated with, but unfortunately we can't, just because of the nature of the type of feature it was itself. Like in the field quarters, they're called barrow pits, and it's basically just a midden, type of midden that was used for like food scraps and stuff. And so unfortunately, it's just piled up food scraps from over the year. Kind of, it reminds me kind of like a compost. You know, how we just throw our stuff into a compost and it's years worth of stuff. And it's the same thing. So the assemblage from the field quarters is reflective of 100+ individuals. And it's really hard to get to that individual level and really say like, oh, this year they ate more pork or this year they ate more beef. I would love to do that. But we just don't have the technology for that yet, or the knowledge for that, sadly.
Hi, I have a question.
Hi.
Hi, this is Steve Marcusy. I really enjoyed your presentation and congratulations on completing your master's. My question is, were you able to access any documentary records from Madison that indicate what rations in the, meat rations may have been provided to the field? Because that to me seems like it might account for some differences between domesticated and wild remains, both pre and post emancipation, and so forth.
Yeah. So actually, I did use some primary documents from the Library of Congress, and I did find that there was a letter from Madison himself to a relative that said that his enslaved community was provided 200 to 300, I believe, pounds of pork. It did not say whether that was weekly or by family or what, but it did say 200 to 300 pounds. And then they also got a few bushels of corn. And during the holiday, they got whiskey or beer. I do not have documentary records about the poundage for the Gilmore farm, and that's more so the nature of the records themselves. At that point, it was census records. But what I can tell you from those is that in 1880, the Gilmore family was noted as having a property value at $26, and that was from one milk cow, 4 pigs, 11 chickens, and 1 horse, something like that. So he also had available, if you say 1 pig is 200 to 300 pounds, the Gilmore family also had access to about 200, 300 pounds in that specific year. So that's about as specific as I can go for that.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yep.
I was going to ask Heather whether the nature of preparation of foods, the tools they had, the implements they had for making it would account for any differences about what animals were chosen between the pre-emancipation and post-emancipation.
That's a really good question. I feel like that, I'm not sure about specific utensils or plates or that type exactly, but I'm thinking a little bit about maybe the tools that they might have used. I have evidence on a few rabbit scapula of punctures, and we think that that relates to trapping, and that is from the Gilmore farm, whereas there are no punctures on the bones from the field quarters, but we know that the field the enslaved community in general was provided guns to shoot pests, to stay out of Madison's crops. And so there could be a difference there between like having a gun and having to use a gun to shoot wild game compared to a trap that you can just set up and leave. And that might have also provided a lot more access for the Gilmore farm in comparison to the field quarters.
And Heather, in regard to the puncture marks on the scapula, I know you're one of the folks on your committee. Ben Ford suggested a cat, and
Yeah.
literally the week after your defense, my cat caught a bunny in the backyard and was carrying it around by the back where the
nice.
scapula was. So fortunately, it was a baby bunny, and I was able to have it be released, so it wasn't hurt. But if it was a large rabbit, you know, I was thinking about it, it would have to really bite in to
Right.
clean it, and that could puncture the scapula. Like
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely would love to at some point do like an experimental archaeology project where I find some metal traps and then also get my cat to bite some rabbit scapula somehow. Already deceased rabbits, preferably. But yeah, that was definitely a mystery of this thesis, is those punctures on the rabbit scapulas.
Well, Heather, my question was, if there was some set of data that you could tap into, like either for the context where you have enslaved Americans at Montpelier or the post-emancipation period, either the Gilmore family or other post-emancipation African-American households, what would that be? Like, what were some of the frustrations you ran up against? You're like, man, I wish I had more data on this.
Well, I found that there was very little information on foodways post-emancipation, sadly. So it was very hard finding a comparison for what post-emancipation diet would have looked like archaeologically. I was able to get that information from primary and secondary resources, and specifically I used books that are actually offered at Montpelier's gift shop. Michael Twitty's The Cooking Gene, Edna Lewis's The Pursuit of Flavor. Those two were really, really instrumental in providing me those recipes that I could look at. And Edna Lewis, coming from a family that was barely removed from slavery, her insight, her first account insight, was really, really useful in constructing what a post-emancipation diet might look like, and then how the Gilmore farm compares. So it was very frustrating. There is not many zooarchaeological studies to compare post-emancipation. And if there are, they're from like the 1980s and 90s, and they're not of African-American sites. They're of Spanish colonies or, you know, other ethnicities. So that was a big one.
I muted myself. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Heather. Really appreciate you giving your presentation. And if you're able to send me your proposal or your thesis, completed thesis, I'll go ahead and send it out to everybody. I think I did a screen grab of everybody's names. I don't know if I got everybody's emails, but I'll try to send it. And if anybody wants to receive a copy and they don't receive it in the next day or two, email either dig@montpelier.org or me at mreeves@montpelier.org, and we'll get you a copy of Heather's thesis. So, and where are you working now, Heather? You said you're working for the Forest Service up in Vermont?
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Yeah, so I'm working for the Forest Service at the Green Mountain National Forest, Green Mountain and Finger Lakes National Forest, so they're kind of merged together. And yeah, I really enjoy it. It's my first federal appointment, so it's been different than, you know, working for a foundation or working for a private firm. But yeah, and if anyone has any questions that they can think of after this presentation, I'm more than willing. Like, this is my life. I love talking about this stuff. So yeah, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to get my information from Matt and reach out to me even after you're done reading my thesis or once you peruse my thesis. If you have any other questions, this is an open conversation. So
is there any way to distinguish, let's say, the 1750 to maybe 1800 period to the post 1800 period after the death of James Madison Sr., and whether the information that you have access to would allow for that kind of distinction to be made, particularly in the field in the pre-emancipation period?
I believe, based on a document that Matt gave to me, that the field quarters stuff primarily stayed encapsulated as the field quarters stuff, because after the death of the Madisons and the selling of the property, that open field kind of reverted back into natural brush and then tree growth. And so I believe that that would have stayed the same there. I do know in the south yard and closer to the house, you have those destruction and occupation layers, which really help you make that difference between the time periods, but I'm not sure if that's present out by the field quarters.
Yeah, you're right on, Heather. That the field quarter contexts are all when the farm was being managed by James Madison Jr., the president. And then we have some really good contexts, like you mentioned, Heather, up by the main house that are capped by rubble filled from 1808 that are all the parents' generation. But in terms of finding a slave quarter that dates to purely to the 18th century, we think we have one out in the south yard under some rubble deposits. And there's got to be some 18th century slave quarters that we just have not found yet in survey that are isolated to the 18th century. Just those sites are seem to be a lot fewer than the retirement era. But we're going to find those in survey, and then we'll have a lot more to look at. And yeah, I see some folks are replying in the comments. I'm going to grab all these so we have everybody's email. So, well, Heather, thank you again so much for giving us the presentation today. And we owe you some royal treatment for everything that you've done for Montpelier. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Congrats on finishing your thesis, and definitely congratulations on the new job. That is fantastic. So.
Well, I definitely look forward to keeping up with Montpelier in the future. So I won't forget about you, I promise. You're in my mind. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks for everybody for attending today. Really appreciate it. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.